June 11th, 1776, Philadelphia. The rented rooms on the second floor of Jacob Graff's new brick house at 7th and Market Streets are stifling. The summer air, heavy with the humidity of the Schuylkill and Delaware rivers, is a foul miasma of city life. The stench of tanneries, the smoke of coal fires, the sharp tang of horse manure rising from the unpaved street below. Inside, a tall, slender man, just 33 years old, with reddish hair and a freckled complexion, stands over a portable writing desk of his own design. He is Thomas Jefferson, a delegate from Virginia, and he is staring at a blank sheet of fine, cream-colored Dutch paper. He has just been handed an assignment that is, in the eyes of the British Crown, an act of high treason, punishable by hanging, drawing, and quartering. He is not being asked to design a fortification or to calculate the trajectory of a cannonball. He is being asked to forge a weapon, one made not of iron or steel, but of ink and ideas. He must find the words to justify the annihilation of a continent's allegiance to its king, to explain to the entire world why 13 colonies are about to declare themselves a new, independent nation, willing to risk everything in a war against the single greatest military power on earth. The weapon he is about to build must be sharp enough to sever the psychological bonds of a century and a half of history, and powerful enough to rally a divided populace to a cause that most still find terrifying, and many simply insane. The central tactical challenge was not, by this point, a military one. The war was already here. Blood had been spilled, cannons fired, cities besieged. The problem was one of definition. For over a year since the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, the colonies had been in a state of armed, open, yet undefined rebellion. They were fighting, but for what? For a redress of grievances? For their rights as Englishmen? For a return to the salutary neglect that had allowed them to flourish before the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties? The tactical and strategic inadequacy of this position had become fatally clear. The old technology of protest, petitions, boycotts, and appeals to common law had failed utterly. This old tech was the argument from history. It was the plea of a subject to his sovereign, based on the 1689 English Bill of Rights and the 1215 Magna Carta. These were powerful documents, but they had a critical design flaw for the American situation. They defined the rights granted by a monarch to his subjects. They were, fundamentally, a list of permissions. The colonists used this tool, most notably in the Olive Branch Petition of July 1775. It was a masterpiece of the old doctrine, addressed directly to King George III, professing loyalty and begging him to intervene against his designing and wicked ministers. But the king had refused to even read it. On August 23, 1775, he had issued his Proclamation of Rebellion, declaring the colonies to be in an open and avowed rebellion and calling on all loyal subjects to suppress it. This was followed by Parliament's Prohibitory Act in December, which effectively blockaded all 13 colonial ports, declared American ships prizes of war, and legalized the impressment of their sailors into the Royal Navy. This was not a tax law. It was a declaration of economic and total war. The old tech of petition was useless against a sovereign who had already declared you an outlaw, outside his protection. The colonists were in the absurd, untenable position of fighting a war for reconciliation with a king who was actively waging war against them. This intellectual vacuum was a strategic liability. George Washington, attempting to forge a professional army out of farm boys and militia, had no coherent cause to offer them. The men in the Continental Congress, operating as a de facto government, had no legal basis upon which to seek foreign alliances, and without an alliance with France, their cause was doomed. The problem was clear. They needed a new technology of thought. They could no longer argue as aggrieved Englishmen. They had to argue as a sovereign people, appealing not to the king's law, but to a higher law. The intellectual ammunition for this new weapon was being shipped from the philosophical battlefields of the European Enlightenment. This new tech was the doctrine of natural rights. Its chief engineer was the Englishman John Locke, who in his 2 treatises of government in 1689 had provided the master blueprint. Locke had inverted the entire structure of power. He argued that government was not a divine mandate from God to a king, but a social contract created by the people for the people. The people, he argued, were born with natural rights to life, liberty, and property. They voluntarily formed a government and gave it just powers for the sole purpose of protecting those rights. And in Locke's most radical conclusion, if a government failed in that duty, if it became a long train of abuses and sought to put the people under absolute despotism, the people had not just the right, but the duty to alter or abolish it. This was the intellectual explosive the colonists needed. But an idea, like a pile of gunpowder, is inert without a fuse. That fuse was lit in January 1776 by a failed corset maker and immigrant named Thomas Paine. His pamphlet, Common Sense, was a 47-page incendiary device. It was not a high-minded philosophical treatise. It was a brutal, brilliant, and visceral assault on the very idea of monarchy. Paine attacked King George himself, calling him the royal brood of Great Britain. He ridiculed the absurdity of an island ruling a continent, and he, for the first time, reframed the entire conflict. This was not a civil war. This was a war for independence. Common Sense sold over 150,000 copies in a matter of months, read aloud in taverns and town squares, transforming the common sense of the people from reconciliation to separation. This new tech had its first field test just weeks earlier in Jefferson's own Virginia. On May 15, 1776, Virginia's convention had instructed its delegates in Philadelphia to vote for independence. Then, a planter named George Mason drafted a Declaration of Rights for Virginia's new constitution. It was the first time Locke's philosophy had been forged into an American state document. Mason wrote that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. This was the prototype. It was the successful test firing of the new weapon. Now, the Continental Congress needed to build the production model. The men tasked with this were a study in contrasts, the Committee of Five. First, there was the engine, John Adams of Massachusetts. Short, stout, brilliant, vain, and colossally argumentative, Adams was the Atlas of independence. He had been pushing for this moment for over a year, battling the cautious and the conciliatory with sheer stubborn force of will. He was, as one delegate put it, obnoxious and disliked, but he was the indispensable man. Second, there was the sage, Dr. Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania. At 70, he was the most famous American in the world, a scientist, inventor, and diplomat whose wit was as sharp as his mind. He was a natural editor, a man of profound wisdom and worldly pragmatism, who understood that the goal of the document was not just to be right, but to be persuasive. Third, there was the ballast, Roger Sherman of Connecticut. A former shoemaker who had become a respected lawyer, Sherman was a Puritan in his morals and a pragmatist in his politics. He was known for his common sense and lack of polish, a man who would ground the committee's rhetoric in reality. Fourth, there was the skeptic, Robert Livingston of New York. Wealthy, aristocratic, and deeply cautious, Livingston represented the powerful, undecided merchant interests of the middle colonies. His presence was a political necessity to ensure that the document did not so alienate the moderates that it split the colonies rather than uniting them. And finally, there was the pen. Thomas Jefferson. At 33, he was one of the youngest delegates and by far the quietest. He was no orator. In the noisy, passionate debates of the Congress, Jefferson was known to sit in silence, listening. But those who knew him, like John Adams, understood that his silence was not emptiness. Jefferson was a true polymath, a man of the Enlightenment, an architect who designed his own home at Monticello, a musician who practiced his violin for hours, a scientist who meticulously recorded the weather 3 times a day, an agronomist, a paleontologist, and one of the finest legal minds in Virginia. He was less a politician than an intellectual system, a man who believed, with religious fervor, in the power of reason and the empire of the mind. And he was a man defined by a profound, agonizing contradiction. He was an idealist who dreamed of liberty, and a planter who owned over 150 human beings. The man who would write that all men are created equal was, at that very moment, a master of slaves, living off their forced labor. This paradox was not lost on his contemporaries, and it would haunt his life and his legacy, the gap between the world he imagined and the world he inhabited. The The choice of Jefferson to be the primary author was a masterstroke of political and psychological management, engineered by John Adams. When the committee met, Adams insisted that Jefferson write the first draft. As Adams later recalled, Jefferson was reluctant. He argued that Adams, as the senior, more prominent figure, should do it. Adams refused. "Reason first," he said, "you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business." This was a tactical masterstroke. Independence, until now, had been seen as a radical New England cause. By placing a Virginian, the representative of the oldest, wealthiest, and largest colony, as its author, Adams made it a truly continental movement. His second reason was more personal. "Reason second," Adams said, "I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise." And his third reason, the one that truly mattered, was a recognition of Jefferson's unique technology. "Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can." Jefferson, trapped by Adams's logic, finally conceded. He retreated to his rented rooms, away from the noise of the State House. He set up his small mahogany laptop, a portable writing desk he had designed for his travels. He had no library to consult, only his own mind and a few essential documents, a copy of George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights and his own draft preamble for the Virginia Constitution. His task was not to invent, it was to distill, to synthesize, to capture the common sense of the subject and give it a voice that was at once rational, legal, and transcendent. He was not just writing a declaration, he was writing the argument that would give birth to a nation. For 17 days, from June 11th until June 28th, 1776, Thomas Jefferson worked. He rose before dawn, when the Philadelphia air was still cool, and after checking his thermometer, he began to write. The process was not a flash of divine inspiration. It was the meticulous, disciplined work of a lawyer building an unassailable case before the tribunals of the world. His objective was twofold. First, to establish a new universal theory of legitimate government, and second, to prove that the British Crown had systematically violated that theory, thereby voiding the social contract and justifying separation. He began by synthesizing his sources. From John Locke's second treatise, he drew the core philosophy. From George Mason's Virginia Declaration, he drew the immediate structure and language. But where Mason wrote of inherent rights, Jefferson, in a stroke of rhetorical genius, wrote of unalienable rights. The distinction was crucial. Inherent means a right you are born with. Unalienable means a right you cannot give away or have taken from you even by choice. It was a right gifted by nature's God, placing it forever beyond the reach of any king or parliament. And where Mason listed the rights as life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety, Jefferson edited with a poet's ear. He streamlined it, elevated it, and made it immortal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He deliberately severed the right from the mere acquiring of property and linked it instead to the far more profound, more active, more American concept of pursuit. This preamble, this single paragraph, was the new weapon in its perfected, most lethal form. But a philosophical case was not enough. Jefferson now had to prove that the king, George III, had been the aggressor. He laid out the long train of abuses, a devastating prosecutorial list of 27 charges. He was building a legal brief. He charged the king with dissolving legislatures, with obstructing justice, with keeping, among us in times of peace, standing armies, and with imposing taxes on us without our consent. And then, in his rough draft, Jefferson included one final explosive charge. It was the longest, most passionate, and most personal grievance in the entire document. It was a searing denunciation of the slave trade, which he blamed squarely on King George. He accused the king of waging cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. He called it piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers. This clause was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. It was Jefferson the idealist, the true man of the Enlightenment, crying out against a system he knew was a moral abomination. But it was also Jefferson the politician, the hypocrite, attempting to absolve Virginia and the other colonies of their own deep complicity by projecting the sin entirely onto the king. It was a brilliant, tortured, and ultimately doomed piece of writing. On June 28th, the innovation was complete. Jefferson presented his draft to the Committee of Five. Franklin and Adams, his chief editors, made small, precise, and powerful changes. Where Jefferson had written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," Franklin, with his secular printer's practicality, crossed it out and wrote the phrase that would echo through history: "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The draft was now ready for the true battlefield. The stage for the climactic confrontation was the Pennsylvania State House. The strategic situation was no longer theoretical. As the delegates gathered, the enemy was literally at the gates. On June 28th, the same day Jefferson presented his draft, a report arrived that a forest of masts had been spotted off Sandy Hook. It was the British Armada under Admiral Richard Howe, over 400 ships, the largest expeditionary force the world had ever seen, carrying 32,000 professional British and Hessian troops. Their objective was New York City, and their secondary objective was to find the members of the Continental Congress and hang them. The delegates were now debating treason with the hangman's noose dangling just outside the window. The heat in the room was unbearable. The windows were kept closed to prevent spies from hearing the debates, and the chamber was infested with horseflies from a nearby livery stable. The enemy inside the room was not a Tory but a patriot. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, the brilliant lawyer whose letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania had helped start the resistance, was now its most eloquent, powerful opponent. On July 1st, 1776, Congress resolved itself into a committee of the whole to debate the resolution for independence. Dickinson rose to speak. He was gaunt, pale, a man in torment. He pleaded with his colleagues for caution. He argued that to declare independence now, with no established central government, no firm military victories, and no guaranteed foreign alliances, was not to steer the ship to port, but to brave the storm in a skiff made of paper. He begged them not to pull down the house in the middle of a storm. Following him was John Adams. The Atlas of Independence rose to his feet. No notes exist of what he said. Jefferson would later recall only that he spoke with a power of thought and expression that moved us from our seats. Adams, passionate, logical, and relentless, argued that the time for petition was over. The king had declared them rebels. The war was here. They had to fight as a defined nation or die as a disorganized rabble. When the vote was taken, 9 colonies voted aye. South Carolina and Pennsylvania voted no. Delaware was split and New York abstained. The resolution had failed to achieve the unanimity they desperately needed. But the fight was not over. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina moved to postpone the final vote until the next day, July 2nd. That night, an exhausted delegate, Caesar Rodney of Delaware, rode 80 miles through a thunderstorm to break his state's tie. South Carolina, seeing the tide was inevitable, agreed to change its vote for the sake of unity. And in Pennsylvania, John Dickinson and Robert Morris, knowing they could not vote aye but unwilling to doom the cause, bravely chose to abstain by simply not attending. On July 2nd, 1776, the vote was retaken. 12 colonies voted for independence. New York abstained. It would approve a week later. John Adams, writing to his wife Abigail, declared that this day, July 2nd, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. The decision to be free had been made, but the battle over the document, Jefferson's Declaration, was only just beginning. For 2 full days, July 3rd and 4th, the delegates put Jefferson's prose to the anvil. For the author, it was torture. He sat in his customary silence, writhing, as he later said, under the assault. The delegates, masters of political pragmatism, were sandpapering his art. They were, in his words, mutilating his composition. Benjamin Franklin, seeing Jefferson's anguish, leaned over, and in a moment of avuncular genius, whispered a story about a hatter named John Thompson who had his sign edited by so many friends that it was reduced to nothing but his name and a picture of a hat. The message was clear. In politics, one must suffer the editors. Then came the climax. The delegates from South Carolina, led by the young aristocratic Edward Rutledge and joined by Georgia, rose to address Jefferson's passionate clause condemning the slave trade. They demanded its total and immediate removal. It was a threat, and everyone knew it. If the clause stayed in, South Carolina and Georgia would walk out, and the United States would be a fiction. But the opposition was not purely Southern. Northern merchants whose fortunes were built on the ships that transported the slaves also wanted the passage gone. It was the moment of truth, the revolution's first and most terrible compromise. The ideal of liberty for all was colliding with the reality of national unity and economic necessity. The clause was struck out. The original sin was now embedded in the nation's birth certificate. Jefferson, heartbroken and furious, blamed the king, the South, and the North. He never forgave the mutilation. Finally, late in the afternoon of July 4, 1776, the mangled document was put to a vote. It was approved unanimously by the 12 colonies present. The Declaration of Independence was adopted. The immediate aftermath was not triumph, but terror and work. The document was rushed to a printer, John Dunlap, who worked through the night to produce the Dunlap broadsides, the first printed copies. These were sent by riders to the state capitals and to General Washington. On July 9th, Washington had the Declaration read to his troops in New York, who were bracing for Howe's imminent attack. It electrified them. They were no longer subjects protesting taxes. They were citizens, fighting for a new nation and a universal creed. The Declaration's new technology of thought had been deployed. It transformed a colonial rebellion into a world war. It was the birth certificate that allowed Franklin, as ambassador, to go to Paris and be received not as a rebel, but as the representative of a sovereign state. It was the document that enabled the French alliance that would ultimately win the war. As for the protagonists, their fates were sealed. The signing of the official parchment copy on August 2, 1776, was the final, defiant act. John Hancock's large signature was a gesture of aristocratic flair and profound bravery. The men who signed it were now the most wanted criminals in the British Empire. Jefferson himself would go on to be a wartime governor of Virginia, a minister to France, the first Secretary of State, and the third President of the United States. He would spend the rest of his life championing education, founding the University of Virginia, and struggling, in both his public policies and his private life at Monticello, with the profound, unresolved contradiction between the words he wrote and the world he owned. The legacy of the innovation was greater than any of its authors. Jefferson's mutilated document took on a life of its own. It became something more than a justification for war. It became a moral standard. It was the text used by abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, who wielded it as a weapon against the hypocrisy of America. It was the text Abraham Lincoln returned to at Gettysburg, arguing that the nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. A new birth of freedom that refounded America, not on the Constitution's legal compromises, but on the Declaration's moral promise. It was the text echoed by suffragists at Seneca Falls and by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as he called for America to cash the promissory note that Jefferson had written. In the end, the story of those 17 days in June is a profound lesson in the nature of warfare. It demonstrates that the most powerful weapon ever forged by humankind is not a sword or a cannon or an atomic bomb. It is a new idea. Thomas Jefferson, the shy, scholarly, deeply flawed idealist, was not a soldier. But in that hot, rented room, he fabricated the intellectual ammunition for a revolution that has never ended. He did not just write the words that gave birth to a nation. He articulated an argument for human liberty that would become the engine of history, a permanent revolution against all forms of tyranny, a promise that America and the world is still struggling, imperfectly but relentlessly, to fulfill.